Today's speaking tip is on audience attitude. And what I mean by that is, what is your attitude toward your audience? This is something that took me years to figure out because in my early years in speaking, I wasn't concerned about my attitude towards the audience. I was just trying to get through my speech. I was trying to remember what I had to say. I hoped everything went in sequence. I didn't leave information out. That's both in my Toastmasters experience and speaking outside of Toastmasters. Because I spoke on a lot of topics, and a lot of times I was in front of brand new audiences, and either I spoke on a lot of social issues that were very controversial, and I needed to make sure I got my points across, or for a number of years, I delivered financial seminars for a financial company that sold retirement programs. And I was just simply trying to get through all the numbers and whatnot on my speech. Where this really came home to roost for me was in my Toastmasters competitions. In 2003, I was at the semifinal level, which is the regionals back then. And I pretty clearly won that competition, but I went over 1 second and was disqualified. So the next year in 2004, I came back, and in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm a regional international speaker. I got to do these lower level competitions to get up and speak at the level I want to speak at. And I went into a division level competition, which is 3 levels up. And my attitude was, thanks for showing up for this competition so I can win this and go on and speak to the audiences I want to speak to. Now, you're right. That's a very arrogant, self-important viewpoint to have. And one of the things I appreciate about the World Champion speech competition is that it had a tendency to give me the lessons in life I needed to learn. And I needed a lesson in humility, and I got it because I lost that speech competition. And the members of my district said, Lance, the guy who beat me gave us everything he had. You didn't give us everything you had. And I didn't. I stood up there like, this is, I'm not giving the effort to talk to you. And I learned a valuable lesson. That is, always respect the fact that there are people that are willing to listen to you. Respect that the audience has showed up to hear you. And if you don't, then just sit down and shut up, because you're doing yourself a huge injustice and you're doing that audience an injustice. We've all been around people that could care less if we were in front of them talking. And to have a speaker be like that and belittle an audience, not that I really belittled the audience, but the point was, I wanted to speak to a higher level audience than I was. So I didn't really grant them the essence of what they deserved as individuals. So you never know who's sitting in your audience. When I talk about respecting the audience, I've talked to a room full of people, and at the end, this older lady comes up, and I can say that now because it's probably 10 years ago. I think she told me she was 70, just turned 70. And I'm like, very nice to meet you, and nice older lady or whatever. And then she tells me that she just finished her 13th Boston Marathon. And I'm like, I've never even run a marathon. I have somebody in the audience that's run 13 Boston Marathons. You know the type of training, the type of dedication, the personal sacrifice, the personal pain and anguish that you go through running a marathon? The stories and life examples that she's had were probably many times what a lot of mine were. I had another gentleman that came up and shook my hand, and he had a book in his hand because I'd like to give you a copy of my book. It was when he climbed Mount Everest. I've never climbed Mount Everest. And when I read the book, I learned how difficult it is and the amount of training he had to do and the dedication that he had. It was a year's worth of training to get even in shape to be able to get to the top of the mountain. And the first year he didn't make it. And he had to come back and train twice as hard the second year to get up there. And it was a phenomenal read. But you never know who's sitting in your audience. I've had a situation one time where I had a older gentleman. He was sitting there sort of overweight, bad dental work, balding, and just seemed like a nice old gentleman. And I made some references to some family members of mine that were involved in the Vietnam conflict. And he came up and shared with me that he was the 13th POW taken in North Vietnam. Spent 7.5 years in a prison camp. And I would have never known that looking at him in the audience. So one of the things that I'm always very cautious about is speaking down to the audience, acting like I'm the most important person in the room, or not even the most important, the smartest. where you look down to the audience, and this is one of the things I see a lot of speakers do, and is they act like they are more important, they're more knowledgeable than the audience. And here's the fundamental, I really, if I'm going to break it down to one thing for you, it's this: humility. Humility comes from the word humble. Humble comes from a Latin word that means ground. That's what it means. So let's take the word ground, and how does that make us humble? What it means is we stand on the same ground at the same level that the audience is. We're not elevated talking down to the audience who's on the ground. We're on the ground talking to the audience. Better yet, put the audience on the stage and speak up to the audience. If you had an audience of Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., John Kennedy, Gandhi, some other, Bishop Tutu, Sister Teresa, these phenomenal humanitarians, would you stand in front of them and say, let me tell you what it takes to be successful? Or would you say, I'm so honored to speak in front of you. Let me share something in my life let me share a story with you, or this is what I would like to talk about today. You'd be very humble in front of that audience. Well, you should be just as humble in front of the audience you're going to speak to. Be thankful that the people showed up to listen to you, and then give them something that made their time worthwhile. Till next week.